Hello, Whitefish! If you're like me, you've been enjoying a beautiful spring, filled with walks along the river, tossing a line in the lake, and mentally preparing yourself to pay yet another exorbitant f***ing property tax bill. I can't wait to say bon voyage to a healthy chunk of money I could have used on childcare, or groceries, or ammunition. You know, the real necessities. Not that I have anything against taxes going towards education, infrastructure, and services. And I'm sure my family will survive, but there are many aging and low-income homeowners who might not. Double wides are literally appraising like lakefront properties, and for some, that tax bill equals half a year's worth of Social Security. So, what's being done about it? The state is pointing the finger at local governments, and local governments are blaming the state. The governor has a task force who is looking into it. So, surely they'll figure something out, right? Yeah, right. My next guest is here to help us make sense of this mess. Dennis Taylor is a former U.S. Marine and Vietnam veteran who spent 45 years of his life serving communities across Montana. His impressive resume includes positions as city manager in Bozeman, Helena and Whitefish, and as the chief administrative officer for the City of Missoula. This insightful conversation didn't just help me better understand the property tax problem, but made me appreciate how diverse the communities across Montana really are and how we are all connected. Today's episode is brought to you by Thrivers Coffee. If you would like to help support the fight against human trafficking, visit thriverscoffee.com to order your coffee and make a difference today. What I was excited to have you on is because, most people, I think, that live in Montana or move to Montana, you find where you want to live to, whether it be Bozeman, Missoula, Whitefish, and you move there and you kind of settle and you kind of get involved. But you have a fascinating history in that you have not only you've lived in pretty much every major area, you've also been involved in city management and the political sphere at the state level. So could you kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your history with Montana?
Well, I'd love to do that. I first came to Montana in 1972. I just got out of the Marine Corps, and I wanted to do something to give back to the country after being in Vietnam. So I signed up to be a VISTA volunteer in service to America. It was a one-year commitment, and you come and work on a variety of issues in local communities. And my assignment was to come to Montana to work for the Montana State Low-Income Organization and work on healthcare access. So I spent a year traveling around Montana, literally in almost every community of any size. We had chapters of the Montana State Low-Income Organization, and I would sleep on people's floors from Lame Deer to Scobie to Whitefish to Missoula, Helena, Billings, Bozeman. So not everybody gets to spend a year coming to Montana and seeing it from that perspective. It was such a good experience, I signed up for a second year, and that led to me going to work for state government as a health planner. So I started in Helena with the health planning organization in the State Department of Health and Environmental Sciences with a job working with the legislature. Ended up going to work for the Montana legislature, was staff to the Senate Local Government Committee and to the Senate Public Health Committee. And from there, I ended up staying either in local government or in state government for 46 years of public service. I did 20 years in local government, 20 years in state government, mostly in Montana, and had the 6 years of national service, which included the time I was in the Marine Corps and the 2 years I was a VISTA volunteer.
So much has happened in that time period in Montana.
Yeah, I had a wonderful life. I have to say that retirement's overrated. I really enjoyed working in local government, and I enjoyed working in state government. And then in my later years, after I had retired, I got called back to be an interim city manager. So that brought me to Whitefish in 2008. I spent 7 or 8 months in Whitefish, had the time of my life, worked with great people, love the Whitefish community to this day, know it in a different way than I would have just visiting. And then I have been the interim city manager in Bozeman twice for about 6 to 9 months each time, as well as the interim city manager here in Helena. I was also the chief administrative officer of the City of Missoula at a time of growth and change. And then I was the city manager here in Helena. I went on to be the city manager in Billings, Montana. And then finally, I finished my career as the city manager of Eugene, Oregon.
That's amazing.
They refer to me as the dean of Montana local government, but maybe I'm more like Forrest Gump.
Yeah.
I've been a lot of places over the last 51 years.
Oh, that's so remarkable. Montana for so many years wasn't really on anyone's radar if you went to other states. Like I grew up here and then went to California, and people would like have to ask me like, where is Montana again? Like back in the even early 2000s. But I don't know if it was Yellowstone or COVID, what really caused the mass migration that we saw.
COVID brought more people to Montana in waves. At the same time, it made our housing so challenged.
And that's kind of what has led to the property tax issue. And, you know, you wrote an incredible op-ed that's how I first heard about you. And that was widely published. I think it was in the Missoulian. It was here in the Interlake, was published in Bozeman. Can you talk about that op-ed and what inspired you to write it?
First of all, I was irked by the suggestion that the property tax crisis that we're dealing with right now was caused by local government, because I didn't think that was the case. You know, I felt like we can all say that our Montana property taxes are too high for homeowners in the state, but the reason for that is a unique situation, unprecedented, that had never happened before. We've been through reappraisal for the 50 years I've been here, and every time there's a reappraisal cycle, the legislature has adjusted the rate of taxation so that the impact on the local homeowner was minimal to none. And this particular year, we had the situation where the state appraisal process increased the value of homes around the state over 35%. So because of the influx of people coming into the state, homes in general across Montana were increasing in their value by some 35%. That's caused a crisis in all Montana cities. Affordable housing is difficult. Workforce housing, you know, a school teacher, firefighter, a nurse can't actually live in most Montana urban areas because the housing is so scarce and the price is so high. So we had that situation where all of a sudden homes are valued more. We have a 2-year reappraisal cycle, and that resulted in an increase of 49% increase in state home appraisals. So right away you have that problem.
Yeah.
And then during the building of the budget under Governor Gianforte, the Department of Revenue, his Department of Revenue said, we really need to change the factor with regard to the tax rate for residential properties. And he didn't heed that warning when he built the budget. And then when we were in the legislative session, again, the department said, if you don't change the factor from 1.35% to 0.94%, this will be a staggering increase on especially homeowners, residential property taxpayers. And they didn't heed that. And then the Senate Democrats tried to get the governor's attention. They wrote him a detailed letter and said, you know, we can fix this by just changing that factor. And what happened was they didn't. So all of a sudden, we have this staggering increase in property tax. And at the same time, they lowered taxes on commercial industrial. So pipelines, transmission lines, railroads got a big tax break, and that burden was shifted onto the backs of homeowners.
That is heavy.
3 years ago, I bought a house in downtown Helena because I wanted to live closer to farmers market and the things that go on in the downtown. I paid $430,000 for this house. With the tax increase that this came out of the last legislature, my property taxes are going to go up $1,200 a year. $100 a month. That's pretty staggering for a pensioner on a fixed income. My daughter, who's an operating room nurse here in Helena, she's a single woman in her 40s. She owns a house. Her property tax went up $600 a year. My daughter and her husband also live in Helena, and he's a retired Special Forces, spent 20 years in the Army, and they live in a house that has their property taxes go up 2,500 a year.
Oh,
So that didn't have to happen. In fact, there were calls to have a special session, and one day they could have fixed the situation, and we wouldn't have this burden on property taxpayers. And it's especially hard on aging Montana. Montana's getting older, especially in parts of our state. That's a really difficult situation for older taxpayers.
especially I can't imagine even for like people that live in more rural areas, whether it be on reservations or more on the east side, where they're not seeing this kind of growth, where it's life is kind of the same, but then to have that kind of increase, we obviously have a crisis with teacher shortage in some of these smaller towns on the east side. So it's kind of ironic that, you know, a lot of property tax goes to fund schools and that sort of thing, but it's also then taking away from the people that are paying, the teachers that are having to pay that property tax.
And we have the lowest paid teachers in the nation. Isn't that sad?
Oh, that's terrible. I've heard that they're thinking of going to a 4-day work week as a way to attract teachers to hire.
That may attract teachers, but it's going to put a burden on working parents that have another day of daycare or some kind of supervision for their kids.
Yeah,
I mean, there are fixes, but they're also painful, and they inflict pain on people who have the least ability to pay.
right. Well, it's interesting because everyone had an opportunity to get a tax rebate this summer from John Forte's administration, I think. And I'm wondering if this was in anticipation of the massive tax increase that was on the horizon. I'm wondering if this was like his way to offset the sticker shock.
You know, I certainly think there was some legitimate intent to give some relief to taxpayers. If you recall, there was both an income tax rebate and a property tax rebate. The property tax rebate was up to $675. So if you're taking me, that's half of what the increase will be. That's a one-time rebate. The tax will increase forever in perpetuity unless there's change in the tax rate. I'm a little cynical about it. I think it was a way to take our eye off of the massive tax shift that this last legislative session created by giving breaks to commercial and industrial, and then putting that what it amounts to a $400 million burden on the homeowner.
That is so shocking. Now, for the uninitiated, can you talk through what is 95 mills and just talking about the property tax allocations to school funding, police and fire, and that sort of thing?
So that's a statewide levy that's imposed to essentially help with school equalization. That's so that every school district has a chance to have the same kind of educational opportunity for students in their district. So that fund is used, and it's allocated through the Department of the Superintendent of Public Instruction to every school district in Montana. The irony is there's no cap on the increase for the statewide mill levies for those important functions, but there is a cap on local government where you can't raise taxes, you can't raise property taxes except for the average of inflation over 3 years. So for this year, that amounted to 2.46%. So no matter where you were in a local government, city or county, because of that statewide tax strategy to hold the increases in local government taxation to less than inflation, there's no way that local governments raised your taxes. The state legislature raised your taxes. Governor Gianforte raised your taxes and gave massive tax breaks to corporations.
Then I don't understand what his argument is that this property tax increase is because of local government. I mean, it's kind of funny because he's like such an advocate for small government, but then he's like blaming this on like local governments, which, as you know, whether like Missoula to Whitefish to Billings to Glendive, like these different towns operate so differently that it's hard to
Correct.
quantify that they would all be responsible when they work so differently.
Yeah. The other part, when I first came here, was right after the new Constitution, and the new Constitution gave communities the ability to adopt self-government powers,
Yeah.
and almost all of Montanans adopted local governments with self-governing powers. And it was designed so that we could solve local problems with local strategies. You know, you can just know that what would work in Billings isn't going to work the same way in Whitefish, and the same way with Bozeman. Say what works in Bozeman is not what's going to work in Missoula.
Right. Right.
And the the Constitution said local governments should be liberally construed, and local governments could do anything through a legislative process at the local level that wasn't prohibited by the state law.
Yeah.
It was laws were supposed to be liberally construed, and so other than an income tax and a sales tax, local governments had wide discretion to raise money in different ways, not just rely on property tax. And most local governments tried strategies. And since the Constitution was adopted, all the way till now, there's like 30 different strategies that have been adopted or considered at the local government level that the state legislature took away.
Right.
So rather than being free to solve problems, the legislature's been jealous of local government power. When the Constitution was adopted, they had a state commission on local government, and they created a 2-year study and made suggestions to implement the local government article of the Constitution. And the legislature spent 2 legislative sessions and did not pass a single one.
Oh.
And instead, they imposed more restrictions on local government. So it's ironic that state government that doesn't live under the same constraints as local government would blame the property tax increase on local governments when they've been basically keeping their thumb on local governments. The last several sessions, the Republican majority have taken away some of the tools that were used in Whitefish and Bozeman and Missoula for revenue-raising options that were adopted by the local community, and then the legislature took them away. There's a local option gas tax in Missoula. I forget what you had in Whitefish, but so it's ironic that they put a cap on the ability to raise taxes, and then they said you can only raise taxes a half of inflation. You know what inflation's been like for homeowners. The same is true for local governments. You know, water, sewer, fire stations, those things cost the same amount of money as you have to do to make your house work too. So
Right.
It's been a problem.
And then there's the issue of like short-term rentals. You know, a lot of cities like Bozeman and certainly Whitefish are trying to regulate that. And, you know, we have zoning laws that make it illegal to have short-term rentals within the city limits. But there are people that are suing the city saying that that is unconstitutional to property owners, which I know Gianforte is very pro-property rights. And I think there is something to be said about that. But at the same time, we also have to look at how do these situations affect our communities with homeowner rates. And then we have that new piece of legislation that passed. That was the future planning law that made it so that cities of a certain size have to have like a 20-year plan. And I know when we first heard about that in Whitefish, our current city manager did a great job explaining it, but a lot of people were pretty irked because there was only a certain window that public comment would be accepted before rules were going to be cemented in place that were brought forth by the state level legislation.
Now, there's another example of putting constraints on local governments, not helping them deal with the changes that are occurring with this influx of so many people.
Mm-hmm.
The vacation rental problem is acute across Montana because it really is a neighborhood destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
It not only takes housing away from workforce housing for local people, it brings a new set of burdens as people behave differently in vacation rentals than they would if they were in your neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a real problem, and I'm not sure that the solution is something that can be done most effectively by the state legislature. It really needs to be done by the local governing authorities.
Oh, I totally agree. And, for me, it's like, I think there's been a lot of talk about, you know, passing some sort of zoning where if you live in the house and you want to rent out an additional dwelling, that's fine. But I think when you have people coming here, with all due respect, and starting their quote unquote whitefish portfolio where they have upwards of 20 properties that they use for short term rentals, which is not an exaggeration from a few different businesses I've seen. That's what really starts to impact. It's like those are 20 houses that are now off the market that families can't move into or rent long term. So, I mean, I think this is where it's going to be a pretty sticky fight because there are homeowners that want to be able to do that. So, I think we're kind of at the beginning of what could be a pretty contentious political sphere as far as this being a top issue for Montana.
Yeah, it's sort of disingenuous to be concerned about affordable housing and then to be happy to see so many units taken off the market.
Yeah.
It makes the housing even more difficult to get. Just like in these tax increases that we're paying, those are going to be passed on to renters.
Right.
So that's going to have an impact not just for homeowners like me, but anybody that's renting will see their rent go up by whatever the property tax increase is that was adopted by the last session.
Right.
So it's a problem, and especially a problem for seniors, I believe.
Right. Oh, totally. I mean, I think Montana has per capita the largest increase in the homeless population in America right now.
And we have, my wife spent 6 years as the chair of the governor's council on aging,
Mm-hmm.
and we have one of the oldest states in the country. So, especially in eastern Montana, there are just so many people who are living lightly and who are aging, and there's no infrastructure of support for them in the local community. So, it seems like a really terrible time to put the increased burden on the residential property owner.
Exactly. I thought, I thought, I'm pretty politically independent, but I always thought like the conservative mindset was to cut taxes, not to increase them, especially on the population. I think it's interesting. There's some bullet points I kind of wanted to talk about so people can kind of get their heads wrapped around some of these numbers. According to the Montana Free Press, which is a very interesting news organization, the median Montana residential property owner will pay 21% more on their taxes this year than they did last year, with typical increases ranging from 11 to 35%. That's according to analysis of the Revenue Department data for the 956,000 properties on the state's property tax rolls between 2022 and 2023. So in aggregate, the owners of residential properties that were on the tax rolls in both 2022 and 2023 will pay about $213 million more than last year. That is a staggering amount.
That's compounded to 420 million that is already part of the tax shift that will occur under this reappraisal process in the 2 years.
Yep. So I guess then to play devil's advocate, that property tax revenue is the primary source of funding in Montana for local government services, including K through 12, law enforcement, and fire departments. So I would hope then that we will then be able to see some substantial increase in services and quality of services, especially for our education system. So I'm curious to see how that money will then be used or reallocated to like the school systems. Is that something you know much about?
Well, I served on the Helena School Board, and I can just say that as long as I've been looking at Montana school financing, they're in the same place as cities and counties. They've had their ability to raise money through the property tax constrained over the last 30 years. So you see a backlog of need for facility improvements, classroom sizes, and teacher pay.
Yeah.
So I don't know that they're going to be a beneficiary of any additional money under this new tax scheme. the big tax shift was away from commercial, industrial, pipelines, mining, utility companies, and then put on the backs of the residential property owner. So the residential property owner now contributes 65% of the state's tax burden, while corporations pay only 42%. That's a complete reversal of what it was 20 years ago.
Really?
About that. That's why a lot of us who are critical of the governor and the Republican legislature are irked that they blame local government, but they fail to talk about the gigantic tax shift, this $420 million that have been added to the homeowner's burden. And it's ironic to me is that the corporations get this big break, and yet when the power company goes before the Public Service Commission, they're granted a 28% increase in their rates without taking into account the major tax gift that they got out of the last legislative session. So that's not in the rate base that was established. So if you're a homeowner, you get hit with the additional tax burden, and then you get hit with higher utility rates. It's just an endless cycle.
The energy sources for Montana are primarily coal, I believe. Is it coal and hydro? Do you know, like
hydro?
Yeah,
coal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. And you think with like these renewable energies that we would be able to manage our energy bills a lot better, because we have such a great source of energy that we get here. Like most states import their energy, where I think we're a pretty big exporter of energy.
We are.
Yeah. I think with the influx of people that moved to Montana, I hear a lot that people wanted to move to Montana because Montana is a red state. And I always find that funny, because growing up here, I think the experience I had was that Montana has always been a pretty purple state. We've had Democratic governors, Republican legislatures, and it's been a pretty like beacon of purple from what I've experienced. I don't know if that's something you've experienced, but it's definitely turned red, I think, more recently. So I'm curious, like, what's your take on how Montana has changed politically and culturally, especially how you've seen it from your experience?
When I first came here, we had Mike Mansfield as the Senate majority leader, and Lee Metcalf was leading efforts to create wilderness areas all across our nation. We had a wonderful delegation. Pat Williams was our senator. So we sent more progressive people to Congress than we have recently. And when I served as a staff to the legislature, the Senate was a Republican majority. So I worked for Stan Stevens, who was the chairman of the Public Health Committee, and I worked for George McCollum, who was the chairman of the Local Government Committee. They're both Republicans. I probably lean a little bit in the other direction, but we were lifelong friends. So even though there was the usual division about perspectives between Republicans and Democrats, it was really a good time to be involved in Montana government. People liked each other. People solved problems. Kids married each other's kids that were from different political parties. And over the years, I saw that eroded. I actually think the biggest change occurred in the 1988 cycle, where Senator Bob Dole from Kansas was on the Agricultural Committee of the Senate, and he was irked at our Senator Melcher. So he brought out a different kind of a political operative in Herb Williams, and they started running these vicious campaigns against incumbent legislators. And Melcher was defeated by Conrad Burns, and the way that our political process changed so dramatically from that time coming forward, we became much more divisive. We used to have like 7 media markets in Montana, and each one would be like local regions having their own conversation about Montana values and Montana priorities. As soon as everybody started getting, cable TV and having I used to call them Montana poppies on every ranch, people started getting national news, and they started framing Montana politics along national lines. And so from 88 on, that's when I think we became more like the nation and less like Montana. And our politics moved dramatically towards the red side. when it had been so purple for all the time I've been in Montana.
Oh, that's such a good point. That is so interesting. Yeah, the nationalization of media, and just these topics that don't really affect Montana, but we just get wrapped into it and we get our opinions. I guess humans just can't help it.
No, I think we're all in each other's camps, but I think we should spend more time listening to each other,
Yep.
having conversations. That's what I loved about being a city manager all these years. I would sit in meetings for hours listening to my neighbors talk about what they wanted to do, what they cared about, and how we might address those. And I always thought the local government was the best place you could see democracy in action. There you have your neighbors, 4 or 5 or 7, whatever is your governing body, listening to their other neighbors every Monday night and solving problems. Where if you go to the state legislature is blocked off from citizens. They're on the floor of the Senate or the House, and there's this whole phalanx of lobbyists. So the average citizen can't really talk to their state legislator in those 90 legislative days the way you can talk to somebody at the Whitefish City Commission meeting, and the next day you can go to a farmer's market and talk to them again. Our elected officials are accessible. They go to Safeway, they go have a cup of coffee, they go to the local bars. And so you can have an interaction with them about policies and direction and values. That's not so at the state legislature anymore. And it's even more difficult to have that conversation with our 3 congressional members. When do you see your congressman? I'm glad that you had Senator Tester on the program, because of all of our leaders in Congress, he's one of the few that comes and talks with local people one-on-one.
Yep.
Throughout his whole career, whether he was the president of the Montana Senate or when he was a leader in the United States Senate, he's always been there for us.
Oh, totally. He's such a wholesome and genuine person. Really embodies, I think, what like a true Montanan is.
And when we were working in Whitefish on the Emergency Services Center, where the courts and the fire and the police are over there,
Yeah.
And that was an idea, but we couldn't have done it without the help of Senator Tester. He brought $900,000 because he came and met with the local leaders, with the city council, and brought that money home so that we could do that. And that's what happens when you have people listening to each other and working together.
Absolutely. Oh, that's amazing. So you spent a lot of time visiting the smaller communities of our state, some that are extremely economically disadvantaged. Montana certainly wasn't built for such a shocking inflow of new residents as we've seen in the last 3 to 4 years. Who wins from this, and who loses from these inflows of people that are mass migrating to Montana?
What's disappointed me with this new recent, say, post-COVID influx or during COVID, more people were coming to Bozeman, Whitefish, Flathead County in general, and Missoula. Those places were loved to death. But the places that could use that, eastern Montana, the Scobies, the Westbys, they didn't experience the same influx of new people. I had talked about the difficulty of having a social service infrastructure for people who are aging. It would be very helpful and beneficial if some of those people would move to some of the smaller eastern Montana communities that are struggling and looking for talent of all kinds. But instead, they've come to the more popular places and basically love those places to death. So it turns out you can't live in Whitefish, you can't live in Bozeman, probably Kalispell or Missoula, because the property tax, the cost of living, the influx of new people, the cost of a house. So more and more people are pushed out of the city, and it's left to newcomers. So that has a couple of bad things. Is people who work in the city usually live outside the city limits because they have to commute a long distance to get in there. So their transportation costs are higher. It's just they can't afford a house. Those of us who live in a house think about maybe they have to get rid of their house or put pressure on people to consider renting out their house for vacation rentals as a source of income.
Right.
But it's just they're coming to the wrong places, and they're coming in ways that make me don't feel like they want to be part of the community.
Yep.
I don't see as many newcomers being as involved as I saw people growing up in Helena over the last 50 years.
That's such a good point to make, in that a strong community really does need a certain amount of inflow of new people to keep the community strong, whether people with resources or different skills. But if like that gets stagnant after a time period, like you said, Montana is aging. And so that's going to have a detrimental effect on the smaller towns. That's a really good point. I think most people don't think about, like when you think about like the Havers or the places near to the Dakota borders, where it's just really remote and really hard to get people inspired to move there. I mean, if you're not going to be having new teachers in these smaller towns, then new families aren't going to be certainly moving to these school systems.
What I like about Helena is it's a service community. There's no big industries. There's no big employers. I think the biggest employer is the state government or the school district or the hospital or Blue Cross Blue Shield. We've got a small college. And so every generation, new people come to work in those service jobs. And so the average age of somebody in Helena is like 32 with a kid in a snuggly walking down Main Street. But that kind of youthful energy that is the core of the city of Helena, they're the same people that take an aging housing stock and put sweat equity into improving them. There's a wonderful old houses in Helena, and they're maintained by young people who move here to work in state and local government or other service industries. And so that's not the same that's occurring, say, in Missoula or Bozeman. They don't have that same infrastructure of long-term younger residents that are working there. It's a real problem, and I hope we find a solution. But the biggest thing for me would be to stop blaming people like the governor blames local government, and to look together at the true facts and work on ways to solve it. The governor is going to put together a task force on property tax and come together to try to figure out ways to reduce the burden on property taxpayers. Some people think that it's just a stalking horse to have sales tax reappear before the state. But there are some real things you could do to mitigate the increase in home values, therefore the increase in property taxes on people, by considering some kind of a cap, especially for, say, seniors, or maybe some way to reduce the tax increase that comes with periodic reappraisals on people until they move. You have a much more valuable house, but it doesn't mean anything to you because you can't afford to move. You may have a 3% interest. People are going to pay 7% now for a house, so they can't afford it. It's more expensive. And so most of us aren't going to sell our house until we're really strapped, because we can't afford to move in a comparable house or even a less expensive house somewhere else. So it creates a stagnation that makes it harder for new home buyers to find a place to live. So maybe there's some way that we can recognize that those taxes maybe don't have to come until the appreciation and the value of the home is actually experienced when people actually sell, rather than when they live in a house for 20 years.
Yeah, that looming sales tax conversation is such a slippery slope when people are so. I mean, I could see maybe a tax on short-term rentals, or a tax on if you're buying like luxury goods. But I mean, people, especially lower income, shouldn't be having to be burdened with more taxes when they're already just so strapped, when the dollar has depreciated so much. I mean, people think that things have gotten expensive, and they have to a certain point, but it's like the dollar is also just depreciated as well. And, that's a whole topic where, it's the long-term prospects of the dollars, that if it does keep depreciating, that's going to have a really terrible effect on states like Montana, when we have such a large population that is lower income, or middle class, or lower middle class.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's the new housing that we need are coming in now as McMansions, when we need workforce housing when we need the missing middle. We work to try to provide affordable housing for low income people in Montana, especially in some of the larger cities. But the real need is for the school teacher, the social worker, the police officer, the firefighter. They can't live in the communities that they serve in these larger communities. And it's because of the tax burden on property taxes, because of the appreciating value of homes in a scarce market. And so that's also part of the reason, the reason people are unhoused is because they don't have a place to live. And where you have a workable strategy to deal with homelessness, you start with finding places for people to live.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But then there's also this very loud small group of the NIMBYs, the not in my backyards, that, they don't want to see anything over 2 stories or 3 stories, but it's like, I think there's a good argument that building up is a good solution in that also helps to prevent urban sprawl, and that also helps with conservation. We have so many marshlands, especially up here in the Flathead Valley, where we've got so many ecosystems at our doorstep that we don't want to step on. So
Yeah, that's been my pet peeve. We should build urban density
yeah,
in cities, not outside of cities where they're on septic systems and wells,
right,
and have complete streets, don't have sidewalks, don't have paved roads. So if you're going to build the urban density, you have to build the urban standards. And you just look around the fringes of all of our cities, and people aren't building the urban standards, and they're going to create problems that will occur in 10 and 20 and 30 years from now.
exactly. Yep.
When I became the chief administrative officer of the City of Missoula, we annexed all the way out to Reserve Street and all of the Rattlesnake. It was great. We finally got the population of the city limits, within the city limits of Missoula, up to 50,000 at the time. But for all those newly annexed places, they had failing septic systems and they had poor water systems. And so we had to retrofit sewer, stormwater, and other public services, sidewalks, streets through existing neighborhoods. And so people were angered that they were annexed, and then they were angered that they had to pay city taxes, and then they were angered that we went through their hot tub or their rose bush in order to put these new facilities in.
Mm-hmm.
And so they told their children, hate local government for 2 more generations. So it's creating these divisions because of bad policies, by constrained annexation rules, and by not creating. Part of the hope of the new Constitution was we craft local solutions with local strategies, new local option taxes that didn't rely on income or the property tax, so that everybody who benefited from urban services would share in the burden of providing urban services. But there's so many free riders right now that live outside the city limits, that work in the cities, that shop in the cities, that have businesses in the cities, and pay no city taxes.
Right. Oh, that's such a good point. And it's interesting how the resort tax for Whitefish has actually been, I think, a pretty good success. We're talking about not taxing people, but a form of taxing with a resort tax has worked really well for Whitefish. It's brought in a lot of money. It's been recently, 10% has been recently allocated to affordable housing initiatives. So I hope that, it's, what's your, yeah.
I was going to say, and Whitefish has been very creative in their use of tax increment financing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's helped with the revitalization of downtown Whitefish. It helps with your new city hall. It helps with your school. That may not work the same way in Missoula the way it did or does in Whitefish. And that's the whole idea. Don't wait for the state legislature to tell communities what to do in 90 busy legislative days. Leave it to the local governing bodies, county and city, to solve these problems locally, and allow them to be creative, allow them to have more tools. Don't put 30 different prohibitions on what self-government, local government communities can do.
Yeah.
See, we've gone the wrong direction for the last 30 years. and it's made it more difficult to address the problems that are in our face right now.
Are there any other examples from other cities or communities that have introduced legislation or done something that has been successful to their communities that you've seen that you're like, oh, this worked in Billings, this worked in Bozeman, or maybe something that you've done? Like, what's some things that have worked?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is there was a local option tax on gas tax
Yeah.
to help with maintaining streets in Missoula. That was passed by the voters, and the legislature took it away. So
Oh,
they lost and had to fill it up. When I was at the City of Helena, we were trying to deal with 70,000 people who live in the metropolitan area, but only 20,000 people at the time were paying for urban services. So we thought, what if we had um, employment privilege tax, a head tax on people who work for employers inside the city limits, so that people who come in and out of Helena could help support it. And that was one of the issues that was not adopted because of the concern that it was just another tax.
mm,
In Billings, the city commission voted 10-1 to have a right-of-way franchise fee imposed. And then there was such an uproar, primarily from cable companies and from utility companies, that the city commission reversed itself and changed its mind. Yet when I went to Eugene, Oregon, they also do not have a sales tax, and so they're experiencing in Oregon the same kind of pressures on property tax that we have for schools and local governments. But that right-of-way fee was approved by the state Supreme Court and is still in place. So there are tools that we could have had that have been preempted once we put them in place by the state legislature, or just haven't been given the opportunity to be tried at the local level. So I think there's a lot of ideas and a lot of things that we could come up with if the state legislature would get out of the way,
yeah.
and if the state legislature would take the 30 things that they've denied to self-government powers and actually live with the spirit of the Montana Constitution, which was to give the local communities the power to do things locally.
What do you love about Montana? Wrapping up here, like what just makes why have you stayed in Montana through all of this? You know, you've seen literally every corner of this state and worked at this level. Where is your heart at with Montana?
Yeah, I was going to say Montana's been very, very good to me and my family. We came here and made a life, got involved in our communities. I raised my children. My children had outstanding educations, both at the local Helena School and Missoula School District level, as well as from the University of Montana and Montana State, where my daughter, who's a nurse, went to school for her nursing degree. What I liked was that this is a place where people help you survive. Your neighbor might help you shovel your walk if you have health problems. If your car gets in a ditch, people push you out. People listen to you. People, I love to go into coffee shops and bars in Montana because people will look you in the eye and talk to you. And that's what we need to preserve. It's like a place that values neighborhoods, neighbors.
Yeah.
I love Whitefish because you got basically 1960s ski bums and railroaders and new people coming in with great wealth and people coming down from Canada, and everybody has a good time and shares their ideas. Look at all the things that you've done in Whitefish that defy the odds of your healthcare facilities, your trails that you've created over the last 20 years. So that's what I loved about Montana is if you wanted to do something, you just do it.
Yeah.
You talk to your neighbor, you get a group, you go out and make it happen.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
that's why I stayed here. Is I got to do more things in the last 50 years here than I ever would if I had stayed in San Francisco.
Oh, that is so true. There's a lot of gumption in this state. Final question. Are you a Cats fan or a Grizz fan?
I'm both.
Okay.
I studied public administration at the University of Montana. And so I have Grizz loyalties, and I especially have Grizz loyalties at this time of the year when they're going to compete for the national championship. But having worked in Bozeman 2 different times, I'm quite smitten with Montana State University. My younger daughter went there as a freshman before she transferred to Missoula, and then went there for her nursing degree. And it's a wonderful university. It's a great town. And so we're lucky to have both Cats and Grizz.
Yeah.
Although when my daughter was going to nursing school, she kept giving me Bobcat gear, and she said, "Dad, how come you never wear your Bobcat gear?" And I said, "Well, I'm a Grizz."
Right.
But then after I spent more time there, I can honestly say I wear my Bobcat gear and my Grizz gear depending on the game.
I love that. You can be friends with both neighbors on both sides of the house.
Right.
Those neighbors might not get along, but that doesn't mean we can't get along with both of them.
No, and we have, and there's so many great colleges. Helena College and Missoula College and the Gallatin College.
Yep.
So it's not just the university systems, but these community colleges are making a bigger impact and making it more likely that people can have higher education, be trained for good paying jobs. And that's all maintained through the Montana university system. So we're fortunate to have such a good university system. And again, I think pound for pound, all across, big city, small city, we have some of the best local governments in the country, even with the constraints put on them, and even with the pressures on the homeowners.
Oh, that's great. I totally agree. Well, you'll have to come up sometime. Have you been to the new Wachold Center at FVCC, that new Performing Arts Center?
I've not.
Oh, it is epic.
I can't remember what it's called, but you have performing arts at the high school.
Yep.
Auditorium there, like a Bach festival or whatever. That was another thing where right there at I think is it the high school? No,
it's the middle school. Yep, it's the Performing Arts Center.
Yeah, that's one of the best performing art venues in Montana, and it's partly a partnership between the school and the community, mm-hmm. And it's fun. But it's about time for me to travel up to Whitefish and say hello to my friends.
Well, make sure you hit me up when you come up, and we'll go grab a beer and we'll chat.
I'll do that.
Awesome.